He stood at gate 14 with 40 white roses trembling against his chest, and for the first time in his disciplined, calculated life, Ahn Do-yoon had no idea what he was supposed to do with his hands. 36 years old, heir to an empire that stretched across shipping lanes and semiconductor plants and glass towers that scraped the Seoul's skyline. A man who had never once in his adult life allowed uncertainty to sit in his chest without crushing it into a plan. And yet here he was, standing beneath the fluorescent glow of Incheon International Airport, holding flowers that were already beginning to wilt at the edges, waiting for a woman who had vanished from his life 7 months ago without a single word of goodbye. He had gotten an anonymous message 3 days earlier, 6 words, "She is coming home, flight KE 702, that was all, no name, no explanation." He should have deleted it. He should have known better than to let hope claw its way back into a heart he had spent months trying to seal shut. But he had come anyway, because some part of him, the part that still remembered the sound of her laugh, the part that still woke up some nights reaching for a side of the bed that had been empty for 7 months, refused to stop believing that Zuri Coleman might still be out there somewhere, that she might still come back to him. He had spent 3 weeks choosing the ring now hidden in his coat pocket, rejecting one design after another until the jeweler, exasperated but patient, finally understood exactly what Do-yoon was describing. Something that looked nothing like the ostentatious pieces his family's name usually demanded. Something quiet. Something that looked like it belonged to a woman who had never once cared what his last name was worth. The rooftop he'd reserved overlooked the exact bend in the Han River where they'd once sat for hours on a bench, early in their relationship, arguing cheerfully about whether soju or wine paired better with instant ramen, a memory so small and so ordinary that he'd never told anyone about it, not even her. And yet it was the memory that had convinced him, somewhere in the months that followed, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life collecting 1,000 more just like it. Around him, families reunited. A grandmother wept into the shoulder of a soldier in uniform. Children ran shrieking toward parents home from business trips. Ordinary joy, ordinary love, unfolding in every direction, while Do-yoon stood frozen at the edge of it, gripping 40 roses like a man holding onto the last rope before a fall. If you've ever waited for someone you weren't sure was coming back, you already know exactly how his chest felt in that moment, like hope and dread had learned to breathe in and out of the same lungs. Stay with me, because what walks through those doors next is going to change everything you think you know about this story. The arrival board flickered. KE 702 landed. His heart slammed against his ribs. He watched the doors. He watched every stranger's face, searching, discarding each one the instant it wasn't hers. Minutes stretched like hours, and then the doors slid open, and Zuri Coleman stepped through them. She was thinner than he remembered. Her eyes carried a kind of exhaustion he had never seen on her before, the exhaustion of someone who had spent months looking over her shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, practically, the hair of a woman who no longer had the luxury of vanity. She wore a plain grey coat 2 sizes too big for her, and in her arms, wrapped in a small blue blanket, was a child. A little girl, no older than 6 months. Do-yoon's entire body went numb. Zuri's eyes found his across the terminal, and for one suspended second, the noise of the airport disappeared entirely. 7 months of silence, 7 months of grief he had told no one about, 7 months of being told by his own father that she had used him and left, all of it collapsed into the single second their eyes met again. Her lips parted, she mouthed his name. And that was when Do-yoon noticed the 2 men in airport security uniforms who had been standing too still, too alert, near the pillar to her left. That was when he noticed a 3rd man near the exit, speaking quietly into his sleeve. That was when he understood, with the cold clarity that had made him such a formidable businessman, that these men were not airport security at all. Zuri saw it too. He watched the terror ignite behind her eyes as she clutched the child tighter to her chest. "Do-yoon," she started. "Don't move," he said quietly, stepping toward her, dropping the 40 white roses to the floor without a second thought. "Just don't move." But the men were already closing in. If you're new to this channel, this is where I need you to hit subscribe, because this story is about to take you somewhere you will not see coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single sequence of what happens next. To understand how a man like Ahn Do-yoon ended up on his knees on an airport floor, gathering roses meant for a proposal that would never happen the way he planned it, you have to go back. Back 7 months, to a version of Do-yoon who still believed the world made sense, who still believed that if you worked hard enough and loved someone honestly enough, life would simply let you keep them. 7 months earlier, Ahn Do-yoon had been exactly what everyone expected him to be, the flawless heir to Ahn Global Holdings, a conglomerate his grandfather had built from a single textile factory into an empire spanning shipping, technology, and finance. He wore tailored suits like armor. He spoke 4 languages fluently and used all of them to negotiate, never to laugh. He had been groomed since childhood to inherit a throne, and he had never once questioned whether he wanted it. Then he met Zuri Coleman. She was a financial auditor, on secondment from an American firm hired to review the compliance practices of one of Ahn Global's subsidiaries. She was sharp-tongued, unimpressed by wealth, and completely unwilling to defer to him simply because of his family name. Their first meeting had been an argument over a discrepancy in a shipping manifest that she refused to let go, even after his assistant had asked her 3 times to move on to the next agenda item. With respect, she'd said, closing her laptop with a snap that made his assistant flinch, I didn't fly 14 hours to sign off on numbers that don't reconcile just because the man across the table has a nice office. And I didn't build this company, Do-yoon had replied, by letting numbers go unreconciled because someone was tired. She'd looked at him then, really looked at him, the way almost no one in his life ever bothered to, and said, good. Then we're going to get along fine, Mr. Ahn, because I'm not going anywhere until this makes sense. He found himself, against every instinct he had, utterly captivated. Their romance built slowly, carefully, in stolen dinners and late-night phone calls, in the quiet hours after her audits ended and before his board meetings began. She made him laugh in a way no one else had ever managed. He made her feel, for the first time in years, like someone was actually listening to her instead of simply tolerating her presence. Neither of them had planned to fall in love. Both of them had fallen anyway. He took her, on one of their first real nights together, to a small noodle stall in a back alley near Yuljiro that his grandfather used to take him to as a boy. A place with no sign and no menu, just a woman who had been ladling the same broth for 40 years. Zuri had laughed so hard at his attempt to explain the history of the place in broken, overly formal Korean that she'd nearly choked, and he remembered thinking, watching her wipe tears of laughter from her eyes at a plastic table under a bare bulb, that he had never once brought anyone here who mattered to him before. Your world is going to hate me, she told him once, quietly, 3 months in, tracing the rim of her wine glass in the dark of his apartment. You know that, right? Heir to Ahn Global bringing home a black American auditor with no family name anyone here has ever heard of. They're going to have a field day. My world, Do-yoon said, has never once asked me what makes me happy. I'm done asking it for permission. It wasn't only romance, though he would later tell himself it should have been enough to focus only on that. Zuri's audit of the shipping subsidiary dragged on longer than either of them expected, extended twice by a client who kept requesting additional documentation that somehow never fully satisfied the discrepancies she flagged. She mentioned it to him only once, in passing, exhausted after a 14-hour day. There's something off in the manifests for the Busan route. I can't tell if it's sloppy bookkeeping or something worse. I keep meaning to dig deeper, but every time I ask for the underlying contracts, they send me something incomplete. Probably just sloppy, Do-yoon had said, distracted, kissing her temple. My father's shipping division has always been a mess of paperwork. Let it go for tonight. He would replay that moment more times than he could count in the months that followed, wondering what might have changed if he'd asked one more question instead of kissing her goodnight. 6 months into their secret relationship, Do-yoon decided he was going to marry her. He had already spoken to a jeweler in Cheongdam-dong about a ring. He had already reserved a private rooftop restaurant overlooking the Han River. He had already begun, quietly, to imagine a future entirely different from the one that had been mapped out for him since birth. A future where Zuri Coleman sat beside him at every table, not behind him, not hidden. What he did not know was that Zuri had stumbled onto something far larger than either of them. While finalizing her audit of one of Ahn Global's subsidiary shipping companies, Zuri had noticed a pattern that didn't add up. Payments routed through shell companies in 3 different countries. Cargo manifests that listed goods far more valuable than what customs records showed being taxed. A separate, hidden ledger that tracked money moving to numbered accounts with no clear owner. At first she thought it was simple tax evasion, serious, but survivable, the kind of thing corporations quietly settled with regulators. Then she found the names. Politicians, judges, a senior prosecutor, all receiving quiet, untraceable payments timed suspiciously close to favorable rulings, dropped investigations, and conveniently overlooked violations. And beneath all of it, a pattern of technology transfers that shouldn't have been legal, proprietary defense-adjacent designs moving out of Korea through Ahn Global's shipping network to buyers who had no business receiving them. She had found, without meaning to, evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Korean government and industry. And somebody had noticed that she'd found it. If you've ever had that sick feeling of realizing you've seen something you weren't supposed to see, you already know exactly what Zuri felt in that moment. Keep watching, because what happens to her next is the reason this entire story exists. Zuri didn't know it yet, but from the moment she copied those files onto a small flash drive, intending to bring the discrepancies to Do-yoon directly, the one person she trusted enough to help her make sense of it, she had become the single greatest threat to a conspiracy that had taken decades to build. She never got the chance to tell him. In the days before it happened, she noticed small things she brushed off as paranoia. A black sedan idling too long outside her apartment building, a phone call that disconnected the moment she answered, twice in one afternoon, a colleague at the firm mentioning, almost too casually, that someone had asked about her travel schedule. She told herself she was overtired, that months of late nights chasing numbers that didn't add up had made her jumpy. She promised herself she would tell Do-yoon everything that weekend, over dinner, away from the office, away from anyone who might be listening. She didn't get the weekend. 3 nights before she planned to show him everything, a car pulled up beside her on a quiet street 2 blocks from her apartment. She remembered very little of what happened next, a cloth pressed over her mouth, the sudden lurch of being lifted off her feet, and then darkness. She woke up in a bare room with no windows, her wrists bound to a chair, a single bright light overhead. A man she had never seen before, calm, well-dressed, terrifyingly polite, sat across from her and explained, in a voice utterly devoid of malice, exactly how the rest of her life was going to go. "You have 2 options, Miss Coleman," he said. "You disappear quietly and never make contact with Ahn Do-yoon or anyone connected to this family again, or you don't disappear and we make sure Do-yoon disappears instead, permanently. The choice, I assure you, is entirely yours." There was no third option offered. There never had been. Zuri fought. She screamed his name until her throat gave out. She refused, for the first 4 days, to sign anything, to say anything, to give them the surrender they wanted. But when they showed her photographs, proof that they had people watching Do-yoon's every movement, proof that his death could be arranged to look like an accident within the hour if she refused, something in her broke, and something else, something fiercer, took its place. She realized that the only way to keep him alive was to become, in his eyes, someone who had never loved him at all. They erased her, wiped her phone, forged a resignation letter to her firm, planted a fabricated paper trail suggesting she'd taken a large payoff and left the country voluntarily. They moved her, under constant surveillance, first to a compound outside Seoul, and then, weeks later, to a remote location outside the country entirely, cutting off every possible route back to the life she'd built. It was in that first compound, terrified and alone, that Zuri discovered she was pregnant. She has told me, in the version of this story that survived to be told at all, that she sat on the floor of that bare room for hours after finding out, one hand pressed to her stomach, grieving for a life her daughter would never get to know her father in, and yet somehow, impossibly, finding a reason to survive that she hadn't had the day before. As Hana grew from a newborn into a crawling, curious infant, Kwon's people grew more anxious rather than less, aware that a growing child meant a growing risk of noise, of routine, of the kind of small human unpredictability that made a tightly controlled captivity harder to manage. They moved Zuri twice more within that first year, each new location more remote and more heavily guarded than the last, until she found herself, by Hana's first birthday, in a compound so isolated that she sometimes went weeks without hearing anything beyond the wind and the distant sound of waves. The guards assigned to watch her were not unkind, exactly, she has said since, that most of them seemed like men simply doing a job they didn't ask questions about, men who brought her extra blankets in the winter and looked away when she cried. But there was always, beneath their small mercies, the unmistakable knowledge that they answered to someone who had made it very clear what would happen to her and to Do-yoon if she ever tried to run. She learned to read the compound the way she had once read financial statements, patiently, methodically, looking for the one inconsistency that would tell her everything. Meanwhile, in Seoul, Ahn Do-yoon received a phone call informing him that Zuri Coleman had resigned from her firm without notice and left the country. He remembered standing in his office, the ring he'd purchased still hidden in a drawer of his desk, staring at his phone as though it might somehow ring again with a better explanation than the one he'd just been given. Then he received, through his father's assistant, a folder of forged financial records suggesting she had accepted a substantial payment from a rival conglomerate in exchange for information. Information she had apparently decided he wasn't worth staying around for. The documents were meticulous, professionally constructed, complete with a wire transfer record to an account bearing her name and a resignation letter in her own handwriting, forged so precisely by Kwon's people that even Do-yoon, who knew her signature as well as his own, found himself unable to spot the forgery. He read that letter perhaps 200 times over the following weeks, searching each time for some hidden signal, some proof that the woman who wrote it hadn't meant a single word. He never found one because there had never been anything to find. The letter he was searching for clues within had never been written by her hand at all. He didn't believe it, not at first. He hired investigators. He spent months and considerable sums trying to find any trace of her, only to be met, at every turn, with a trail so cleanly fabricated that even his most skilled people came back telling him the same thing: she left Do-yoon. She's not coming back. He kept a private investigator on retainer under personal account his father's assistants never saw, a quiet, discreet man named Oh who reported back every few weeks with nothing new. Oh once told him, gently, over coffee in a nondescript cafe far from any office where they might be recognized, that in 15 years of this work he had rarely seen a disappearance engineered this thoroughly. Whoever did this, Oh said, didn't just want her gone. They wanted every question you might ever ask to lead nowhere. That takes resources most jilted lovers simply don't have. Do-yoon had filed the observation away without fully understanding, at the time, how prophetic it would prove to be. It would be nearly a year before he understood that Oh had been circling, without either of them realizing it, the exact edge of the truth the whole time. He called every number he had for her, disconnected. He flew, without telling anyone, to the address she'd once given him in the United States, only to find an elderly couple living there who had never heard the name Zuri Coleman in their lives. He hired investigators. He spent months and considerable sums trying to find any trace of her, only to be met, at every turn, with a trail so cleanly fabricated that even his most skilled people came back telling him the same thing: she left Do-yoon. She's not coming back. His father, Chairman Ahn Do-yoon, made his position clear from the very beginning. This is what happens, he told his son coldly, when you let sentiment interfere with legacy. She used you. Be grateful you learned this lesson before the wedding, not after. Slowly, month by month, The man who had once laughed freely at Zuri's jokes disappeared, replaced by someone colder, someone who buried himself in acquisitions and negotiations with a ruthlessness that even his father found impressive. In one meeting, 3 months after Zuri vanished, Do-yoon forced through the hostile acquisition of a smaller logistics firm with a coldness that left the company's founder, a man twice his age, visibly shaken as he left the boardroom. "You built something small and sentimental," Do-yoon had told him, without a trace of the warmth that once defined him, and sentiment doesn't survive contact with people who have stopped believing in it. His father had watched from the head of the table, and for the first time in Do-yoon's life, had looked at his son with something like pride. It should have felt like victory. It felt like nothing at all. He signed the paperwork that night alone in his office, and instead of celebrating, he found himself staring at the drawer where he'd once kept a ring he could no longer bring himself to return, wondering when exactly he had started measuring his days by how efficiently he could make other people afraid of him. He told himself over and over that he had simply been a fool, and that fools did not get to keep hopping. He deleted her number, and then 2 weeks later at 2 in the morning, retyped it from memory into a new contact just to have it saved somewhere. He walked past the rooftop restaurant overlooking the Han River 3 separate times over the following months, always at night, always alone, never once going inside. He never stopped searching. He just stopped telling anyone that he was. He kept a private investigator on retainer under a personal account his father's assistants never saw, a quiet, discreet man named Oh who reported back every few weeks with nothing new, and who eventually, gently, suggested that perhaps it was time to stop paying him to look. Do-yoon never took the suggestion. "If you've ever loved someone the whole world insisted didn't deserve it, stay with me, because everything you've been told so far is about to be turned completely upside down." For nearly a year, Zuri Coleman lived a life that barely resembled a life at all. Moved between 2 secure facilities, always watched, always reminded of exactly what would happen to Do-yoon if she ever tried to make contact. She gave birth alone, in a private medical suite arranged by her captors, guarded even in the hours after her daughter was born. She named the baby Hana, beginning, the first true thing in a world built entirely out of lies. The birth itself had been one of the loneliest experiences of her life, a private medical suite with no family present, a doctor whose name she was never given, and 2 guards stationed outside a door that never fully closed, as though even in labor she might somehow find a way to escape. She has said the only thing that got her through it was picturing Do-yoon's face, imagining, even knowing it wasn't true, that he was somewhere just outside that door waiting to see his daughter for the first time. She raised Hana in secrecy for months, learning the rhythms of her captivity well enough to identify its cracks. She built, in those early months of motherhood, small rituals of resistance that no one could take from her. She sang to Hana every night in a low voice, songs her own mother had sung to her as a child in Georgia, determined that her daughter would grow up knowing something of where she came from even if she never got to see it. She taught herself, through a single sympathetic guard who occasionally smuggled her books, to read the shift patterns of the facility as fluently as she'd once read balance sheets, cataloging which nights the perimeter watch grew thin, which routes a supply truck took twice a week, filing every observation away against the day she might finally need it. She noted which guards grew careless near shift changes. She learned which doors were checked and which were assumed secure simply because no prisoner had ever tried them before. She began, quietly and patiently, planning an escape she knew she might only get one chance at. The evidence she'd copied all those months ago, the flash drive she'd hidden the night before her abduction, tucked inside the lining of a coat she'd left behind at her old apartment, remained, unbelievably, unrecovered by her captors. A contact she trusted, an old friend from her audit firm who had helped her navigate the visa process years earlier, had quietly retrieved it after her disappearance, suspecting something was deeply wrong, and held onto it without knowing what it truly contained. She spent weeks before that studying the smallest details of the facility's rhythms, which guards smoked outside near the loading dock at the same time every night, which camera in the east corridor had a dead angle she'd only discovered by counting ceiling tiles during an escorted walk to the infirmary, which door had a lock mechanism that stuck if you tugged it a certain way, something she'd learned entirely by accident one evening when a guard fumbled his keys. She rehearsed the route in her mind every night after Hana fell asleep, over and over, until she could have walked it blind. The night Zuri finally escaped, she did so with Hana strapped against her chest, moving through a service corridor she had spent 4 months memorizing, timing her exit to the exact 90-second gap between security rotations. A guard nearly caught her at the final checkpoint, his flashlight sweeping the darkness just short of where she pressed herself against the wall, Hana miraculously silent against her chest, as though the baby somehow understood what was at stake. She has described that 90 seconds as the longest of her entire life. She reached her old friend 3 days later, a quiet, careful man named Marcus who had known her since her first year at the audit firm and who had spent months, after her disappearance, refusing to believe the official story that she'd simply taken a payoff and left. He met her at a train station 200 kilometers from the facility, recognized her instantly despite how much thinner and harder her face had become, and simply pulled her and Hana into his car without asking a single question about where she'd been. It was 3 more days, hidden in a spare room in Marcus's apartment, before Zuri felt safe enough to ask him for the flash drive. He handed it to her without hesitation, only saying quietly, "I always knew something was wrong. I'm glad you're alive." He had kept it, she learned, in a safety deposit box under his mother's maiden name, checking on it every few months like a man tending a grave, never once looking at its contents out of respect for whatever secret she'd been protecting. For the first time in nearly a year, Zuri allowed herself to imagine going home. It took another 2 weeks of careful planning, a passport arranged through a contact of Marcus's who owed him a favor from years back, a flight booked under name close enough to her own to pass a cursory check, but different enough to avoid immediate flags, and the anonymous message she finally worked up the courage to send to a number she still had memorized after all those months. 6 words she'd rewritten a dozen times before settling on the simplest version she could manage. She had no way of knowing if Do-yoon would even see it, let alone believe it, let alone come. She boarded the flight anyway, because staying hidden forever had never once felt like a real option to her, not with a daughter who deserved to know her father, and not with evidence in her bag that could finally make the people who'd stolen a year of her life answer for it. But going home meant walking directly back into the reach of the people who had taken everything from her, and this time, she wasn't just carrying herself. She was carrying evidence powerful enough to bring down some of the most protected men in Korea, and a daughter who had never once been safe in her entire short life. And that brings us back to Gate 14, to 40 white roses scattered across an airport floor, to 2 men disguised as security closing in on a reunion 7 months in the making. Do-yoon didn't wait for them to reach her. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides, placed himself between Zuri and the approaching men, and said, low and urgent, "Whatever this is, we're not doing it here. Follow me, now." "Do-yoon, I don't." "Trust me," he said, and something in the way he said it, steady, certain, exactly the way he used to sound before the world convinced him she'd betrayed him, made her legs move before her mind had finished deciding. They didn't make it to the parking garage. The first man reached them near the currency exchange, reaching inside his jacket in a motion too practiced to be anything but rehearsed. Do-yoon, who had spent years in mandatory Hapkido training he'd always assumed was pointless corporate tradition, drove his shoulder into the man's chest hard enough to send him stumbling into a luggage cart. Zuri screamed as the second man lunged toward her, and it was pure instinct, 7 months of learned survival, that made her twist Hana away from his reach and drive her elbow into his throat. A third man, the one who had been speaking into his sleeve, drew closer, his hand disappearing inside his jacket in a way that made every instinct in Do-yoon's body scream that they were no longer just running from men who wanted to talk. Travelers around them began to notice, phones rising to film, a woman screaming somewhere near the currency exchange, and in the middle of it all, a duty-free display of chocolate boxes crashed to the floor as Zuri shoved past it, Hana's small cries lost beneath the growing chaos of the terminal. Alarms began sounding. Airport security, real security this time, started converging on the commotion, which was, ironically, exactly what saved them. In the chaos of shouting officers and startled travelers, Do-yoon grabbed Zuri's hand, and they ran, weaving between luggage carts and a tour group frozen in confusion near the escalators, not stopping even when Zuri stumbled, not stopping until the doors of a taxi finally closed around them, and the airport shrank into the distance behind fogged glass. They didn't stop running until they were 3 kilometers away. In the backseat of a taxi, Do-yoon had flagged down with hands that were shaking for the first time in years. Only then, gasping, Hana crying softly between them, did Zuri finally say the words she had rehearsed for 7 months in a windowless room. "I didn't leave you, they took me. I have proof of everything, why they did it, who's behind it, all of it. Do-yoon, she's yours, Hana is your daughter." Do-yoon looked down at the little girl in her arms, his daughter, a person who had existed for months without him knowing her name, and something inside him that had been frozen since the day he was told Zuri had abandoned him finally, violently, broke open. "I believed them," he whispered. "God help me, Zuri, I believed them." "They made sure you would," she said. "That was the whole point." If this story has grabbed you the way it grabbed me the first time I heard it, make sure you're subscribed, because what Zuri reveals next about the man behind this conspiracy is going to make you question everyone you thought you could trust in this story. They spent that first night in a cramped motel outside the city, paid for in cash, curtains drawn, Hana finally asleep between them. Zuri laid everything out, the audit, the shell companies, the payments to officials, the evidence that Ahn Global's shipping arm had been used for years to move technology and money for people whose names, she suspected, went far beyond a single rogue executive. Do-yoon listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every new revelation, watching a version of his family's empire he had never allowed himself to see clearly. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "My father," he said slowly, "has always had a man he trusts completely with the company's international logistics. Someone from outside the family who's been with us since before I was born. His name is Kwon Min-suk. He practically raised me when my father was too busy building the company to notice I existed." Do-yoon, Zuri said carefully, "one of the names on that ledger, tied to the largest and most consistent flow of hidden payments, is a Kwon." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Hana stirred in her sleep. "That's not possible," Do-yoon finally said, though the certainty in his voice had already started to crack. "I need you to trust the evidence," Zuri said gently, "even when it hurts." There were harder nights too in that first week of hiding. Do-yoon, exhausted and still reeling, once snapped at her in frustration when she refused to explain a detail about the flash drive's contents, some old instinct of hers to hold back information until she was certain who could be trusted with it. "I am not one of them, Zuri," he said, sharper than he meant to. "I have spent 7 months believing you abandoned me. The least you can do is let me help you now." She looked at him for a long moment before answering, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You want to know why I didn't tell anyone anything for 7 months? Because the last time I trusted the wrong person with information, they used it to destroy my entire life. I'm not doing that again, not even with you. Especially not with you, because I can't survive losing you a second time." He hadn't had an answer for that. He'd simply sat down beside her, taken Hana from her tired arms so she could finally sleep, and stayed awake the rest of the night learning, for the first time, what it meant to earn someone's trust back one small act at a time instead of demanding it. In the quieter hours between those first hard conversations, Zuri watched something unfold that made even those frightening days feel almost bearable. Do-yoon, a man who had once negotiated hostile takeovers without blinking, sat cross-legged on a motel floor, completely undone by an 11-month-old who refused to sleep, unless he sang to her, badly, off-key, the same 3 lines of an old Korean lullaby his own grandmother had once sung to him, repeated over and over until Hana finally quieted in his arms. "You're terrible at this," Zuri had told him, laughing for what felt like the first time in months. "She doesn't seem to mind," Do-yoon had said, glancing down at his daughter with an expression Zuri had never seen on him before, not even in the easiest days of their romance. Something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with empires or legacies or anything he'd ever been taught to want. I spent 36 years being told what I was supposed to care about. Turns out it was this the whole time. Trust would prove to be the most dangerous currency either of them had left, because the deeper they dug over the following days, tracing accounts, cross-referencing names, quietly reaching out to the one journalist Zuri had once trusted with sensitive information, the more it became clear that Kwon Min-suk wasn't simply complicit. Chairman Ahn Do-yoon had known Kwon Min-suk for nearly 30 years, had personally promoted him twice, had stood as a witness at Kwon's wedding decades earlier, when neither man had children of his own yet to worry about. There had been moments, over the years, when small inconsistencies crossed the chairman's desk, a shipping subsidiary's numbers that never quite reconciled, a customs official's sudden and unexplained resignation, a whispered rumor at an industry dinner that he dismissed as competitor gossip. He had noticed, he had always noticed, and each time, some calculation he'd never fully examined convinced him that pulling the thread wasn't worth what it might unravel, that Kwon's usefulness outweighed his own unease, that a company built across 3 generations couldn't survive too many uncomfortable questions asked too publicly. It was a calculation. He would admit only once, quietly, to his son that he had learned from his own father, and one he deeply regretted teaching in turn. Kwon Min-suk had joined Ahn Global as a junior logistics manager nearly 30 years earlier, the son of a dockworker who had spent his entire life watching men born into wealth make decisions that determined whether his family ate that month. He rose quickly, earning the elder chairman Ahn's trust through a combination of genuine competence and an instinct for making himself indispensable. Until he had become, in all but blood, a member of the family he served. Somewhere in those early years of loyal service, something in him had curdled, a conviction, Zuri would later theorize from the pattern of his earliest transactions, that a system which had made him wealthy only by proxy, only by serving someone else's name, owed him a fortune of his own. For nearly 2 decades, Kwon had used his position of trust within the Ahn family to build a shadow network beneath the legitimate business, funneling stolen technology to foreign buyers, laundering the profits through shell companies, and using a portion of that fortune to buy the silence and cooperation of judges, prosecutors, and politicians who could make inconvenient investigations disappear. 3 separate deaths over the years, a whistleblowing engineer, a customs official who'd asked too many questions, a journalist who'd started digging, had all been ruled accidents. Zuri now had reason to believe none of them were. Their investigation nearly ended before it began. 3 days after their escape from the airport, moving between safe houses in a borrowed sedan Han Seo-jin had arranged through a cousin's dealership, Do-yoon noticed the same black SUV in his mirrors for the 3rd time in 20 minutes on the highway outside Suwon. "Zuri," he said quietly, "don't look back. We have a problem." "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need you to hold on to Hana as tight as you can." What followed was 20 minutes, that Zuri would later say aged her more than the entire 7 months of captivity combined. Do-yoon weaving through afternoon traffic with a controlled precision that startled even her, cutting across 3 lanes to make an exit ramp at the last possible second, the SUV behind them clipping a guardrail as it tried to follow and falling back just long enough for them to lose themselves in the tangle of a rest-stop parking structure. They abandoned the sedan there, walked 11 minutes to a bus terminal, and boarded separate buses to the same eventual destination, meeting again 4 hours later in a motel outside Cheonan, both of them shaking, Hana somehow still asleep through all of it. "They know we are moving," Do-yoon said, once his hands had finally stopped trembling enough to hold a cup of coffee. "Which means they know roughly where we are. We can't stay in one place more than a night from now on." It was Zuri, methodical even in exhaustion, who suggested the pattern that kept them safe for the following 2 weeks, never booking anything under real names, never using a phone for more than a day before discarding it, always choosing accommodations that took cash and asked no questions. They crisscrossed the country that way, from Cheonan to Daejeon to a fishing village outside Yeosu, where Han Seo-jin had a family property, no public record connected to her name, building their case one document at a time in the margins of a run that never fully stopped. The fishing village safe house very nearly became their undoing. On their 9th night in Yeosu, a local fisherman mentioned to a cousin, who mentioned to a shopkeeper, who mentioned to a man asking unusually specific questions about recent visitors to Han Seo-jin's family property, that a foreign woman with a baby had been staying in the old house by the harbor. Zuri woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of a car engine idling too long on the gravel road below the property, and by the time Do-yoon had confirmed through the window that it was not a delivery truck or a lost tourist, they had less than 10 minutes to gather what they could carry and slip out through the property's overgrown back garden toward a neighbor's boat that Han Seo-jin had, fortunately, insisted they keep fueled and ready from the very first day. They spent that night adrift half a kilometer offshore, engine cut, lights off, Hana pressed silent against Zuri's chest, while 2 flashlight beams swept the darkened windows of the house they just abandoned. It was nearly dawn before Do-yoon finally judged it safe to bring the boat quietly into a different inlet, and neither of them spoke, in the hours that followed, about how close the 10-minute margin had actually been. Chairman Ahn Do-yoon, Do-yoon's own father, appeared in the ledgers too, not as the architect, but as a man who had, at some point, discovered fragments of what was happening and chosen to look away rather than risk the empire's reputation. Complicit through silence, if nothing else. He let this happen, Do-yoon said quietly, staring at his father's name on the screen. He let people die to protect the company. Or to protect you, Zuri said. From what I've read, your father built walls around you your entire life. Maybe this was just another wall. Do-yoon didn't answer. He simply reached over and took his daughter's tiny hand in his, as if reminding himself exactly what he now had left to protect. Over the following 2 weeks, moving between safe houses arranged through Zuri's few remaining trusted contacts, they built a case. They confirmed the identities behind 3 of the shell companies, tracing one registered address to a serviced office in Singapore that turned out, after Han Seo-jin quietly pulled corporate filings, to share a single administrative assistant with 2 other shells on the list. They obtained a recorded phone call, passed to them by the journalist Zuri once knew, in which a mid-level Ahn global executive discussed payment terms for a shipment that matched the illegal technology transfer pattern almost exactly. The journalist, a soft-spoken but relentless man named Park Yi-min, who had been quietly investigating Ahn Global's shipping division for over a year after the death of the customs official, met them only twice, always in public places, always insisting on switching phones between meetings. I've had 2 sources go quiet on me in the past year, he told them the first time, sliding a manila folder across a coffee shop table without ever looking directly at either of them. One stopped answering calls, one had a car accident. I don't believe in that many coincidences. Zuri spent long nights laying the numbers out the way she once laid out audit findings for a boardroom, translating the raw ledger into a story anyone could follow. Over 11 years, more than $40 million had moved through the 3 shell companies into accounts linked to 6 government officials, timed with unsettling precision against dropped investigations, favorable customs rulings, and a defense technology export license that should never have been approved. Cross-referencing shipping manifests against the falsified customs declarations, she and Park identified 9 separate shipments over 4 years that had carried restricted semiconductor designs out of the country disguised as industrial machinery parts, sold to a buyer whose ultimate ownership traced back, through 2 more shell companies, to a foreign state-linked investment fund. This isn't corporate fraud anymore, Park said quietly, the first time he saw the full picture laid out in front of him. This is a national security case wearing a business suit. Every piece fit. Every piece pointed toward a public reckoning that could finally end Kwon Min-suk's 20-year reign of manipulation. Do-yoon began quietly, testing which of his father's inner circle might still be trustworthy, eventually arranging, through Han Seo-jin, a meeting with a contact she believed could get them safe passage to a prosecutor untouched by Kwon's influence. She agreed to arrange it herself, at a warehouse near the old shipping docks she'd once visited for legitimate contract work years before. She never should have. The mole, they would learn far too late, was a young paralegal at Han Seo-jin's own firm, a man named Yu who had been quietly feeding information to Kwon's people for over a year in exchange for payments large enough to cover a sick mother's mounting medical bills. He hadn't known, he would later claim, what the information was truly being used for, only that a well-dressed man had offered him more money in a single conversation than he made in a year, and that refusing had never felt like an option once he understood who was really asking. The meeting had been a trap. Kwon Min-suk, alerted through Yu's careless mention of the warehouse location in an email he'd believed was secure, arrived instead of Han Seo-jin, flanked by 6 armed men. "You should have stayed hidden, Zuri," Kwon said calmly, stepping into the dim warehouse where the meeting had been arranged, his voice as gentle and unbothered as it had been the day he first ordered her disappearance. "I gave you every opportunity to disappear quietly. Instead, you've made this so much more complicated than it needed to be." Do-yoon stepped in front of Zuri and Hana, fury replacing the last fragments of the composed heir he used to be. "You've spent 20 years destroying my family from the inside," he said. "You raised me, you sat at our table, and this whole time—" "This whole time," Kwon interrupted, "I built something far greater than your grandfather ever dreamed of building, using the resources your family was too comfortable to notice were being taken from them. Don't lecture me about betrayal, Do-yoon. Your father knew enough to look away years ago. I simply gave him a reason not to look too closely." The flash drive, hidden inside the lining of Hana's diaper bag, was found within minutes. Kwon's men tore the safe house apart with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Zuri fought until one of Kwon's men struck her hard enough to drop her to the ground, Do-yoon lunging toward her only to be restrained by 2 more men, a blow to his ribs dropping him to his knees. "Take her," Kwon said simply. "Leave him. He needs to understand exactly what losing everything feels like before this is over." They took Zuri. They left Hana screaming in Do-yoon's shaking arms and disappeared into the night with the only evidence that could have exposed them. If you've ever felt like everything you fought for was ripped away in a single moment, you already understand exactly what Do-yoon felt kneeling on that warehouse floor. This is exactly the moment where everything changes, so if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because the next sequence is where this story turns completely. For 3 days, Ahn Do-yoon existed in a state somewhere between grief and fury he had never experienced in his life, packing the length of Han Seo-jin's safe house at night while Hana slept, replaying the warehouse ambush over and over, searching for the moment he could have done something differently, refusing every attempt Han Seo-jin made to convince him that blaming himself accomplished nothing. On the second night, he finally allowed himself to sit with Hana in the dark, her small hand curled around his finger, and made her a promise he had no way yet of knowing whether he could keep. "I'm going to bring her home," he whispered. "Whatever it costs, I promise you that." He hid Hana with Han Seo-jin, the lawyer whose trap had nearly cost them everything, who had, it turned out, been genuinely detained by Kwon's men the night of the meeting, and who now, horrified at what her own network had been used for, agreed to help him without hesitation. He returned to his father's estate for the first time in months, and for the first time in his life, he didn't ask permission before demanding answers. "You knew," Do-yoon said, standing in his father's study, Chairman Ahn's composed face flickering for just a moment with something that looked almost like shame. "Some part of you knew what Kwon was doing, and you let it happen because exposing him would have exposed you." His father didn't deny it. "I built walls to protect this family," he said quietly. "I didn't build them to protect Kwon. I never imagined it had gone this far." "He has Zuri," Do-yoon said. "He has the mother of your granddaughter. And if you have any information left in this family that can help me find her, I need it now, or I swear to you, I will burn this entire company down looking for her myself." Whatever remained of Chairman Ahn's carefully guarded control seemed to crack at the mention of a granddaughter he hadn't known existed until that exact moment. His hand, Do-yoon noticed, trembled slightly as he reached for the glass of water on his desk. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. 2 days later, in a moment neither of them had planned, Chairman Ahn insisted on meeting Hana himself, arriving at Han Seo-jin's guarded safe house with none of his usual entourage, just an old man in a plain coat standing awkwardly in a doorway. Hana, who had shown wariness around every unfamiliar adult since her rescue, studied him for a long moment before, unexpectedly, reaching her small arms up toward him. Chairman Ahn Young-ho, a man who had built an empire on the principle that sentiment weakened judgment, lifted his granddaughter into his arms and wept, silently, for the first time his son had ever witnessed. "I let this happen," he said quietly, over her small head, not looking at Do-yoon. "Not just to Kwon, to you. I taught you that love was a liability years before Kwon ever taught me that loyalty could be bought. I don't know which lesson did more damage." "It's not too late to teach a different one," Do-yoon said. His father held Hana a little tighter, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, simply nodded instead of arguing. "There's a facility," he said, "registered under a shell company I once flagged years ago and was told to forget about. Kwon has used it for private matters before. If he's holding anyone, that's where I'd start looking." For the first time since this had all begun, father and son worked toward the same goal. Do-yoon assembled what allies he could in the days that followed, though trust came slowly and unevenly to a man who had just spent a year discovering how thoroughly he could be deceived by people close to him. When Han Seo-jin first offered her help, tracing the shell companies through old filings she had quietly preserved, Do-yoon found himself watching her with a wariness that surprised even him. She had, after all, worked alongside Kwon Min-suk for over a decade, sat in the same meetings, drafted contracts that, in hindsight, bore fingerprints of the very network they were now trying to dismantle. "You drafted the original shipping agreements for 3 of those shell companies," Do-yoon said to her bluntly during their second meeting, sliding a folder of her own old paperwork across the table. "Convince me you didn't know exactly what you were signing." Han Seo-jin didn't flinch. "I drafted what I was told were standard offshore logistics agreements for tax efficiency," she said. "I've spent the last 3 days going back through every one of them, and I found language buried in 2 of the contracts that I should have questioned at the time and didn't, because questioning things wasn't what junior counsel did at this firm 15 years ago. I've been sick about it since the moment I realized what I missed. If you don't trust me, I understand completely, but I'd rather spend the rest of this fighting to fix what I let slide past me than spend it defending myself to you." It was that answer, more than any document she produced, that convinced Do-yoon she could be trusted, the willingness to admit fault rather than perform innocence. He would need that same instinct, he realized later, to eventually forgive himself for everything he hadn't questioned closely enough either. Others proved harder to vet. A childhood friend who had once worked in Ahn Global's finance division quietly declined to help at all when Do-yoon reached out, citing vague concerns about his own career, a refusal that struck Do-yoon as strange enough to warrant a closer, quieter look that ultimately turned up nothing simple cowardice, not complicity, though the distinction had felt uncomfortably thin in the moment. A cousin on his mother's side, eager to help and eager, Do-yoon suspected to be seen helping, was gently kept at a distance from anything sensitive after Zuri pointed out that his business partner had unexplained ties to one of the flagged shell companies. It amounted to nothing in the end, but neither of them were willing anymore to assume good intentions simply because a name was familiar. Meanwhile, in a facility outside the city, Zuri was held in conditions far harsher than her first captivity. No comfort now, no illusions of choice, only Kwon's calm, terrifying patience as he tried to extract from her the location of any backup copies of the evidence she might have made. She gave him nothing, not because she wasn't afraid, she has said since, that she had never been more afraid in her life, but because giving him nothing was the only power she had left, and she intended to use every last bit of it. He tried, over those days, every method he had refined over 2 decades of controlling frightened people. He was gentle at first, almost fatherly, bringing her tea himself and speaking of Hana with a warmth that made her skin crawl more than any threat could have. When gentleness failed, he grew colder, describing in flat, precise detail exactly what would happen to Do-yoon if she continued to withhold information. A car accident on a mountain road, he suggested once, almost thoughtfully, would be easy enough to arrange and impossible to disprove. Still, she gave him nothing. Zuri built, in those isolated months, a mental ledger of everything she intended to do the moment she was free again, not just escape, but accountability, a full accounting of every name, every dollar. Every falsified document that had stolen a year of her life, and Do-yoon's peace of mind along with it. She has said that keeping that ledger, rehearsing it in her mind night after night the way she once rehearsed audit presentations, was what kept her from losing herself entirely to fear. An auditor's mind, it turned out, was exactly the kind of mind captivity could never fully break, because it insisted, stubbornly, on believing that eventually, if you were patient and precise enough, the numbers always told the truth in the end. She spent the hours between his visits thinking of Hana, of the sound of her daughter's laugh, of the single photograph she had memorized down to the last detail, Do-yoon holding Hana at the safe house, both of them caught mid-laugh at something Zuri could no longer remember, a photograph Han Seo-jin had taken on her phone almost by accident. She held that image in her mind like a shield. "You're stronger than I expected," Kwon admitted, on the third night of her renewed captivity, studying her with something that might have been genuine curiosity. "Most people break by now." "Most people," Zuri said, "don't have a daughter waiting for them to come home." Kwon was quiet for a long moment. "I had a daughter once too," he said finally, something flickering behind his composed expression before vanishing entirely. "It's remarkable, the things we convince ourselves we're protecting them from." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. She had learned by then that understanding a monster's reasons rarely made the monster less dangerous. Do-yoon spent those 4 days barely sleeping, running scenarios with the former operator, a broad, quiet man named Choi who had once served in Korea's Special Warfare Command before a wound to his knee ended his career. Choi laid printouts of the facility's blueprints across a safe house table each night, tracing routes with a red marker, eliminating options one by one. "This isn't a rescue where you get to be reckless because your heart is broken," Choi told him bluntly on the second night, when Do-yoon suggested simply storming the front gate. "You'll get her killed, and yourself, and probably me too. We do this precisely, or we don't do it at all." Choi had not taken much convincing to join them. Years earlier, during a logistics dispute that had turned violent at one of Ahn Global's overseas ports, Chairman Ahn had personally intervened to get Choi's wounded unit evacuated when official channels were tangled in bureaucratic delay, a debt Choi had never forgotten and had long assumed he'd repay in some small, unremarkable way. "I didn't expect it to look like this," he told Do-yoon dryly, the first night he laid the blueprints across the safe house table, "but a debt's a debt." Han Seo-jin, meanwhile, worked to confirm through old permit filings exactly which building on the property held the detention cells, cross-referencing water and power usage records that suggested one wing of the facility drew far more electricity than a standard storage warehouse ever should. On the fourth night, Do-yoon's small team moved. The rescue was not clean, it was not easy. It involved a perimeter breach through a drainage access point the former operator had identified from old blueprints, a moment near the outer fence where Do-yoon froze completely at the sound of a guard's radio crackling 20 feet away, Choi's hand gripping his shoulder hard enough to bring him back to himself before the moment cost them everything. Inside, the facility was larger than the blueprints suggested, corridors branching in directions Han Seo-jin's research hadn't fully mapped. A guard rounded a corner without warning, and Choi dropped him silently before he could raise an alarm, a competence that left Do-yoon staring at his own trembling hands and understanding, for the first time, the true weight of what they were attempting. A firefight erupted near the detention wing when a second guard did manage to shout a warning, leaving one of Kwon's men dead, and Do-yoon himself grazed by a bullet along his forearm. the pain barely registering against the adrenaline driving him forward. For nearly 90 seconds, pinned behind an overturned equipment cart, while Choi exchanged fire with two guards in the corridor ahead, Do-yoon believed with total certainty that they had failed, that Zuri would remain behind whatever door lay at the end of that hallway, and that he would die in a warehouse outside Seoul, having never told her he still loved her, still forgave her for nothing, because there had never been anything to forgive. Then Choi's voice, flat and controlled, "Corridors clear, move." They found Zuri in the third room they checked, and at the very center of the facility, Do-yoon finally stood face to face with Kwon Min-suk again, Zuri chained to a chair between them. "You won't shoot me," Kwon said calmly, watching Do-yoon raise the weapon he'd taken from a fallen guard. "You've never been the kind of man who could pull a trigger, Do-yoon. That's exactly why I always knew I'd win. You knew a version of me that stopped existing the day I found out you'd taken her," Do-yoon said. "But you're right about one thing, I'm not going to shoot you." "Then we understand each other," Kwon said, something almost like relief crossing his face. "We understand each other," Do-yoon agreed. "You just don't understand what happens next." He lowered the weapon and said, "I'm going to make sure the entire country watches you lose everything instead. Every account, every name in that ledger, every death you thought would stay buried. I'm going to make sure you spend whatever's left of your life knowing that the family you spent 20 years exploiting is the family that finally ended you." Kwon's composure, for the first time since Do-yoon had known him, cracked at the edges. "You're gambling everything your family built on a piece of evidence you haven't even confirmed will hold up in court." "I'm not gambling," Do-yoon said. "I already know it will. Zuri built it. She's never once been wrong about a number in her life. If you think this story is over, trust me, it's just getting started. Because what happens in that final confrontation is unlike anything I've told you so far, and you do not want to miss it." The rescue succeeded. Zuri was freed, bruised but alive, and reunited with Hana within hours. But Kwon Min-suk, warned by the sound of approaching sirens, escaped through a route the rescue team hadn't anticipated, vanishing into the night with the resources of 20 years of hidden wealth still at his disposal. He had lost the flash drive in the chaos of the rescue, recovered by Han Seo-jin from the facility's security office, where Kwon had foolishly kept it close, confident no one would ever reach it. But losing evidence didn't mean losing power, and in the days that followed, Kwon Min-suk did exactly what men like him have always done when cornered. He attacked from every direction he had left. He leaked a fabricated scandal to the press suggesting Do-yoon had embezzled company funds to fund an affair, a story that ran across 3 major outlets within a single day, complete with anonymously sourced quotes from supposed insiders who did not exist. Do-yoon watched his own face on the evening news beside a headline questioning his fitness to lead the company his family had built, Zuri sitting beside him in a rented apartment holding Hana, both of them realizing in real time exactly how far Kwon was willing to go to bury the truth beneath a louder, uglier lie. He pressured contacts within the prosecutor's office, several of whom had been on his payroll for years, to open an investigation into Do-yoon instead of himself, resulting in an unannounced raid on Ahn Do-yoon's private office that made headlines of its own before anyone could clarify who was actually under suspicion. He even attempted, through an intermediary, to have Chairman Ahn quietly removed from the company's board, circulating a private letter among major shareholders suggesting the chairman's judgment could no longer be trusted, hoping to seize enough control to bury the evidence entirely before it could be made public. It very nearly worked. For nearly a week, Do-yoon watched a smear campaign built on decades of Kwon's careful relationships threaten to undo everything they had risked their lives to expose. And there were nights, during that week, when he confessed to Zuri that he wasn't certain the truth would be enough against a man who had spent 20 years learning exactly how to bury it. "It doesn't need to be enough on its own," Zuri told him, holding the flash drive that Han Seo-jin had finally recovered from the rescue site's security office. "It just needs the right person to make sure it can't be ignored." But Chairman Ahn, for the first time in decades, chose his son over the empire's image. He called an emergency board meeting. And the room fell silent the moment he walked in, every executive present sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. For 20 years, Chairman Ahn began, his voice steady despite what it clearly cost him, a man I trusted more than almost anyone in this room used this company to move stolen technology, launder money for corrupt officials, and when necessary, arrange the deaths of anyone who threatened to expose him. I did not orchestrate this, but I suspected enough, at points over the years, to have stopped it sooner than I did, and I chose instead to protect this company's reputation. That failure is mine, and I will answer for it however the board and the law decide I must. A senior board member, a man who had served alongside Kwon for over a decade, rose immediately in protest. Chairman Ahn, surely there's a way to handle this quietly to protect the company's stock price while. There is no quiet way to handle 3 murders, Do-yoon interrupted, standing beside his father for the first time in that boardroom as an equal rather than an heir waiting his turn. My father and I have already turned over full documentation to prosecutors. This board can either get ahead of that truth or be buried by it. Those are the only 2 options left. The vote to cooperate fully with the ensuing investigation passed with only 1 dissent, and the evidence his son and Zuri Coleman had risked their lives to recover was handed in full to prosecutors who had not been compromised. The journalist published his story the same week, years of research finally validated by the evidence Zuri had risked everything to protect. The story detailed the stolen technology transfers, the bribed officials, the 3 deaths disguised as accidents, and the international manhunt for a man who had spent 2 decades hiding in plain sight as one of Korea's most trusted corporate executives. Kwon Min-suk was arrested 11 days later, attempting to board a private flight out of the country under a false name, his final attempt at escape undone by an alert customs officer who recognized his forged passport photo from the news coverage that had, by then, saturated every major outlet in the country. Do-yoon testified on the 3rd day of the trial, sitting across a courtroom from the man who had raised him more than his own father had, describing in careful, measured detail the 20 years of manipulation that had nearly cost him everything he loved. Kwon watched him throughout the testimony with an expression that betrayed nothing, no anger, no remorse, only the same calm composure he had worn the day he first ordered Zuri's disappearance. "Do you have anything to say to the court?" the judge asked Kwon once the evidence had been fully presented. "Regarding the charges against you," Kwon Min-suk rose slowly, adjusted his jacket, and said only, "I built something out of nothing in a system that rewards exactly the kind of ambition I showed. I regret only that I underestimated the woman I once thought I could simply make disappear." He sat back down without another word, and the silence that followed felt, to everyone in that courtroom, far heavier than any confession could have been. Public reaction to the unfolding scandal was swift, and for a company that had spent decades cultivating an image of untouchable respectability, brutal. Ahn Global's stock dropped nearly 30% in the 2 weeks after Park Yi-min's story broke, before stabilizing once the market recognized that the company's own leadership had been the one to expose the rot rather than bury it. Editorial pages debated for months what the case revealed about corporate oversight in Korea's largest conglomerates, and university ethics courses would, in later years, use the case as a study in how quietly complicity could calcify into catastrophe over enough years of looking away. Zuri, for her part, became an unexpected and reluctant figure of public sympathy the moment details of her ordeal became known, though she gave only one interview throughout the entire process, insisting to Park Yi-min that the story belonged to accountability, not to her personally. "I don't need anyone's sympathy," she told him, in the only quote she allowed him to publish under her name. "I need the people in that ledger to face the same consequences anyone else would face for stealing a year of someone's life. That's the only ending that matters to me." Letters arrived at Han Seo-jin's office for weeks afterward, addressed simply to the woman from the airport, from strangers who had followed the case and wanted her to know they were rooting for her, Letters Zuri read every one of, though she answered none of them, still too raw, still too newly free, to know yet how to hold that much kindness from people who had never met her. Zuri did not testify in person. Her legal team, wary of any further exposure, submitted her account through a recorded deposition instead. But she sat in the gallery every day of the trial's second week, Hana with a sitter back at the safe house, simply so she could watch, with her own eyes, the moment a jury finally read a guilty verdict into the record. He was sentenced 3 weeks later to 22 years. The trial that followed took months. Prosecutors, wary at first of pursuing a case against a man with 2 decades of carefully cultivated influence, moved forward only after Park Yi-min's reporting made the story impossible to bury quietly. Several officials named in the evidence resigned within days of the story breaking. 2 others, including the senior prosecutor whose name appeared repeatedly in the hidden ledger, were arrested and charged separately in a scandal that dominated national headlines for weeks. Yu, the paralegal who had unwittingly enabled the ambush, cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for leniency, providing testimony that closed several remaining gaps in the case against Kwon. The company Ahn Do-yoon had spent his life building underwent a reckoning it desperately needed, shedding the shadow network that had operated beneath it for a generation. Shareholders, initially panicked by the scandal, were gradually reassured by the transparency of the company's response, full cooperation with investigators, an independent audit of every subsidiary, and the public restructuring Do-yoon insisted on from the very first board meeting after Kwon's arrest. And through all of it, in courtrooms and press conferences and quiet, careful negotiations, Ahn Do-yoon and Zuri Coleman finally, for the first time since a rooftop over the Han River had been reserved and forgotten, allowed themselves to simply exist together. Safe, unhidden, a family in every sense the word had ever been meant to hold. Chairman Ahn, in the months that followed, stepped back from daily operations of the company entirely, ceding control to an independent board, while Do-yoon made a choice that shocked the entire industry. Rather than take the throne he had been groomed for his entire life, he restructured his role into something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more honest, choosing oversight of the company's ethics and compliance division himself, determined that what happened under Kwon Min-suk would never happen again. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with this story to the end, but we still have one more moment left, and it might be the most important one. The year that followed was not without its own quiet difficulties. Zuri struggled, in the early months, with something she eventually admitted to Do-yoon was more than simple exhaustion. Nights where she woke certain she still heard footsteps outside a locked door. Days where the sound of an unfamiliar car engine sent her heart racing before her mind caught up to remind her she was safe. She began seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, a decision Do-yoon supported without hesitation, sitting in waiting rooms with Hana on his lap, while Zuri did the slow, difficult work of learning to feel safe again in a body that had spent nearly a year believing safety was a luxury she'd never get back. There were sessions she came out of unable to speak for hours, and sessions she came out of lighter than she'd felt in longer than she could remember, and Do-yoon learned slowly not to ask which kind it had been unless she offered to tell him. "I used to think surviving it was the hard part," she told him one evening, months into that process, watching Hana stack wooden blocks on the living room floor of the apartment they'd finally settled into. "Turns out believing I'm allowed to stop surviving and just live is so much harder. You don't have to do that part alone either," Do-yoon said, and for once, he didn't try to fix anything. He just sat beside her on the floor until Hana's tower of blocks finally toppled over, and all 3 of them laughed at the sound of it falling. Do-yoon, for his part, spent those months rebuilding something within the company that had nothing to do with profit margins. He personally interviewed every candidate for the new ethics and compliance division, insisting on hiring people who had once been dismissed elsewhere for asking too many uncomfortable questions, including 2 former regulators who had left government service in frustration after watching their own investigations quietly stall. He restructured the division to report directly to the board rather than through the executive chain Kwon had once controlled, and he insisted, over the objections of several longtime directors, on publishing an annual transparency report auditing the company's own supply chains for exactly the kind of abuse Kwon had exploited for 20 years. It was slower, more expensive, and less profitable in the short term than the way the company had always operated, and Do-yoon told the board more than once that he would rather run a smaller company he could be proud of than a larger one he'd have to keep secrets to protect. Han Seo-jin joined the division as its head counsel, finally practicing the kind of law she'd always wanted to, free of the compromises she'd once been asked to make. Park Yi-min's reporting on the case won a national award for investigative journalism, and Do-yoon made sure, quietly, that the company never once tried to interfere with whatever story he chose to write next. Chairman Ahn Do-yoon retired fully from the board 6 months after the trial ended, spending most of his remaining days, to the quiet astonishment of everyone who had known him for decades, teaching his granddaughter to feed the koi in his garden pond, a task he approached with the same meticulous seriousness he'd once brought to hostile takeovers. He gave a single interview upon his retirement, in which he said, when asked what he hoped his legacy would be, only that he hoped his grandchildren would inherit a family that had finally learned the difference between protecting a name and protecting the people who carried it. It was, Park Yi-min later wrote in a follow-up piece marking the 1-year anniversary of the scandal, the most honest sentence Ahn Do-yoon had spoken publicly in 40 years of running a company built, in no small part, on carefully managed silence. Hana grew in that year from a wary, watchful infant into a little girl who laughed easily and often, who called Do-yoon Appa with a confidence that undid him every single time, who had no memory at all of the windowless rooms and armed men that had shaped the first months of her life, and who would, if her parents had their way, never need to. On a quiet afternoon, nearly a year after that first, terrifying reunion at Gate 14, Ahn Do-yoon stood once again on a private rooftop overlooking the Han River, 40 white roses arranged carefully across a table set for 2. Zuri arrived, not fleeing anyone this time, not running from armed men or hiding behind forged identities, but simply walking toward him in the golden light of late afternoon, their daughter, nearly 2 years old now, full of laughter neither of them had ever imagined possible during those months of darkness, held on her hip. "You kept the roses," Zuri said, smiling at the sight of them. "I told you I would," Do-yoon said. "I just needed a little more time to get here properly." He knelt down, not in front of a stranger's arrival gate this time, but in front of the 2 people who had taught him what it truly meant to choose love over legacy, and asked Zuri Coleman, finally, properly, to marry him. She said yes, before he even finished the question. Hana, held securely in her mother's arms, reached out and grabbed one of the white roses from the table, giggling as her father laughed harder than he had in years. The sound carrying out over the river below, a sound that, for the family who had survived betrayal, captivity, and a conspiracy that had nearly cost them everything, finally, truly, meant home. They married that autumn, in a small ceremony overlooking the same river, nothing like the grand society wedding his family's name might once have demanded, and everything like the life the 2 of them had actually built together. Chairman Ahn walked Hana down a short garden aisle scattered with white rose petals, holding his granddaughter's hand as though it were the most important task he had ever been given. Han Seo-jin stood among the guests, finally free of the compromises her career had once demanded of her. Park Yi-min came too, notebook nowhere in sight for once, simply a friend among friends. Marcus flew in from the United States, meeting Do-yoon for the first time and shaking his hand with the quiet appraisal of a man who had helped keep Zuri alive long enough to reach this exact moment. Zuri wore a simple ivory dress, no veil, nothing hidden about her at all anymore, and when she reached the small arch where Do-yoon stood waiting, 40 white roses arranged behind him one final time, she found she didn't need to search his face for reassurance the way she once had in an airport terminal 7 months into a nightmare neither of them had chosen. She already knew exactly what she'd find there. "I told you I'd get here properly," Do-yoon said quietly as she reached him. "You got here exactly when you were supposed to," Zuri said, "late roses and all." Somewhere behind them, Hana laughed at something only a 2-year-old could find funny, and the sound of it, carrying out over the Han River in the golden light of early evening, was the last thing either of them needed to know, that everything they had survived to reach this moment had, in the end, been worth it.